I will be refuting on guns are not an epidemic in America, and nor do they pose a threat to Americans that can be solved with gun control legislation. He provided two secondary claims, which is gun violence and mass shootings are not epidemic issue that mostly affect law-abiding citizens, and guns makes us safer, and that gun violence cannot be solved with gun control legislation. With his first claim, he provided us with evidence that stating an average of 30,000 people die from guns, and of those 30,000, 61% are caused by suicides. And he also provided that according to the City of Charlotte gunshot study, which is the Department of Criminal Justice, 71% of gunshot victims have had previous arrest records and 64 convicted crimes. And he also stated that from CDC, 80% homicides are gang related, and in Polyfact.com confirms that only 3 to 11% of guns used in crimes are purchased legally in a retail store. 9 in 10 murders are committed with guns obtained outside of laws. 325 million guns in America are simply too many guns to regulate effectively. I found out that, which seems like all of the evidence he used is contradicting his claims, which is that he said that gun violence and mass shootings are an epidemic issue. And then I also found out that he didn't provide me with any any citations. So I found out based on my research, most of those statistics are found in Reddit, and I found out that in the actual CDC website that the number of deaths from all firearms is 336,252, which is more than he stated, and a quarter of guns are sold outside of the background checks. And aside from inaccurate data and no citations, his supporting claim about gun violence and mass shootings are not epidemic issue that mostly affect law-abiding citizens. Well, based on his evidences used, this information does not support his claims. With the true amount of people that die to firearms because of gun violence, this is a pandemic issue and does affect the law-abiding citizens. And then with his second claim, which is he states that guns makes us safer, and he supported that claim with stating 200,000 women every year use a gun to defend themselves against sexual abuse, and that he said that CDC reported on a survey concludes that from 500,000 to 3 million instances that Americans use guns to stop a homicide or to defend themselves. Well, according to Everytown for Gun Safety Support, which is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to understand the amount of people that a nonpartisan organization dedicated to understand and reducing gun violence in America, they state that access to gun actually doubles the risk of death by homicide, and then increases the risk of death by suicide by 3 times, and in a domestic violence, it makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will get killed. And then he went back to his first claim about his Australia's gun buyback. That he asked, like, you may ask, why not confiscate all of the guns? He stated that, well, this has been tried before. Australia had a mandatory buyback program for all Australians who own guns, which were far fewer than America's rate of gun ownership, and yet Australia saw a 1 out of 3 compliance rate of people who were ready to give up their guns. And then he stated that, does anybody really believe Americans will be even more compliant than the disappointing Australian figure? We will see then hundreds of millions of illegal guns in the black market for new Pandora box of disasters. Well, I found out that in the research in 2011, Harvard's David Hemingway and Mary Refutation reviewed the research of Australia's suicide and homicide rate after that national firearm agreement. Their conclusion was clear that the NFA seems to have been incredibly successful in terms of life saved. What they found is a decline in both suicide and homicide rates after the NFA. The average firearm suicide rate in Australia in the 7 years after the bill declined by 57% compared with the 7 years prior. The average firearm homicide rate went down by about 42%. Now, Australia's homicide rate was already declining before the NFA was implemented. You can't attribute all of the drops to the new laws, but there are good reasons to believe that the NFA, especially the buyback provisions, mattered a great deal in contributing to those declines. Hemingway and Bertie's write the drop in firearm deaths was largest among the type of firearms most affected by buyback. Second, firearm deaths in states with higher buybacks rate per capita fell proportionately more than in states with lower buyback rates. There's also this 1996 and 97, the 2 years which the NFA was actually implemented, saw the largest percentage declines in the homicide rate in any 2-year period in Australia between 1915 and 2014. America holds the most gun owners, and most of it are not background checked, which I stated earlier. With the gun control legislation, we can avoid this problem of gun violence because, based on the study of Joshua Tewksbury, there is a correlation of more guns in a country, the more gun violent rates. Likewise, according to Michael Siegel of Boston University, U.S. holds the highest gun homicide rate, and that correlates as well to having the most gun ownership, and also the studies I mentioned earlier that access to guns increases the risk of suicide and domestic violence. Guns are an epidemic in America, and that guns pose a threat to Americans that can be solved with the gun control legislation. Thank you.
All right, you spend a lot of time summarizing the advocate's argument. It's 90 seconds. The first 90 seconds of your speech is all reminding us about every statistic that they presented. And while I appreciate the idea that you want to keep us up to date, the truth of the matter is that you don't then respond to every one of those statistics. You kind of have a more generic response. So why spend the time recapping every one of those points? Just remind us what the advocate's general argument was, and then give us your counterclaims, unless you're responding to particular pieces of information. The one particular piece of information that you responded to suggested that the number of deaths was far higher than the 33,000 that they mentioned. Basically, it sounds like it's 10 times higher. That number, by the way, seems amazing to me. You're saying that more people are killed by guns. In fact, it's probably 10 times as many people are killed by guns as are killed in auto accidents. I think that this is a misreading of the data. I'm not sure who's misreading the data, whether the advocate is or you are. I would have to look at the original sources on this, and that's one of those things that I'm going to try and remember to do when we're looking at this. Now, you did say that the advocate failed to provide citations on information, that it sounds like everything comes from Reddit. And you are suggesting this comes from the CDC, so I'm going to have to make that comparison and look at it. The advocate's second point was that guns make us safer, and then there's some information about self-defense uses. You basically present some other information, a kind of counter information that shows that access to a gun increases the risk of homicide and the risk of domestic violence. These are not raw numbers, they're the risks that you're talking about, and like a 5 times greater risk or a 3 times greater risk, those are good statistics to toss around, but when I'm comparing it to the 500,000 to 3 million uses for self-defense that the advocate's using, I have no way of comparing it except, we've got a rate versus a total number. The total number sounds pretty substantial. I don't know what the rate would result in, so that's a little bit problematic. And then the Australia gun buyback, you went through a lot of information about this. There is one point where the evidence that you cite basically says we can't attribute all of the decline to the gun buyback, but then it proceeds to say, but a significant part of it probably is attributable to that. And I think that, I understand why you want to follow up with that information. That makes sense. The notion that it would make a difference, I think we're back up to some of those arguments that the advocate made earlier that you don't really talk about. If, 71% of the gun crime people had previous contact with the police, 80% of the homicides are gang-related. That sounds like the source of the problem is a specialized group as opposed to a more widespread group, and that might diminish the need for the kind of legislation that you mentioned at the end. I think you need a little bit stronger explanation of those points that the advocate presented at the beginning. All right, thank you.